At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia was a land of staggering contrasts. The glittering palaces and grand boulevards of St. Petersburg and Moscow stood as symbols of immense wealth and privilege, enjoyed by a tiny sliver of the population. The aristocracy and the royal family lived lives of opulence, surrounded by luxury and tradition, seemingly untouched by the hardships that plagued the rest of the country. Yet beyond these gilded walls, the vast majority of Russians endured crushing poverty. In the countryside, peasants toiled endlessly on land they did not own, struggling to feed their families and pay off debts that seemed insurmountable. In the cities, the situation was no better. Urban workers crowded into squalid tenements, their lives defined by hardship and uncertainty. Ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, the Russian Empire clung stubbornly to autocracy. The Tsar, convinced of his divine right to rule, remained distant and unresponsive, ignoring the suffering and growing anger of his people. His court was isolated, surrounded by advisors who shielded him from the harsh realities outside palace gates. The abolition of serfdom in 1861, intended as a step toward modernization, had failed to deliver true freedom. Instead, millions of peasants found themselves shackled by new debts, forced to make redemption payments for land that was often poor and insufficient. Their hopes for a better life were dashed, replaced by frustration and despair. Meanwhile, Russia's rapid industrialization brought its own set of problems. Factories sprang up in major cities, drawing in waves of rural migrants. These new urban workers faced grueling hours, dangerous conditions, and meager wages. Labor unrest simmered as workers began to organize and demand change. Any hint of political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed by the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana. Dissidents were arrested, exiled, or silenced, and the regime's paranoia only deepened the gulf between ruler and ruled. In the countryside, land hunger and recurring famines fueled unrest. Failed harvests left entire villages starving, while the government's response was often slow and inadequate. The sense of injustice grew with every passing year. In the cities, radical new ideas began to take hold. Marxist thinkers and revolutionaries spread their message among the disaffected workers, calling for an end to autocracy and the creation of a more just society. Underground meetings and secret pamphlets stoked the fires of rebellion. The regime's foundations were beginning to crumble. Contradictions between the promise of reform and the reality of repression became impossible to ignore. Protests and strikes erupted with increasing frequency, shaking the confidence of those in power. Revolutionary activists, emboldened by the growing unrest, organized in secret, plotting the downfall of the old order. Decades of discontent had sown the seeds of revolution, and now those seeds were ready to burst into flame. Russia was a powder keg, its people tense and restless, the air thick with anticipation. Military patrols watched nervously as crowds gathered, sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the empire to its core, forever altering the course of Russian and world history. For most Russians, life in the early 1900s meant hardship and few rights. Peasants struggled on tiny plots, facing famine, disease, and heavy taxes. Urban workers, lured by factory jobs, found only overcrowded slums and dangerous conditions. Trade unions were banned, leaving workers powerless to improve their lives. Basic freedoms, speech, assembly, the press, were non-existent. The secret police, the Okhrana, crushed dissent and spread fear. Economic hardship and political repression created a climate ripe for revolution. Disillusionment with the Tsarist regime grew ever deeper. In the early months of 1905, the city of St. Petersburg was a powder keg, simmering with unrest and tension. The streets were filled with anxious crowds, their faces marked by frustration and hope for change. Across Russia, cities echoed with the sounds of discontent as workers and ordinary people grew weary of hardship and injustice. The situation was made even worse by Russia's humiliating defeat in the war with Japan. The military's losses were staggering, and demoralized soldiers returned home, fueling the anger and despair of the population. The government's failures on the battlefield only deepened the sense of crisis. Amid this turmoil, a charismatic priest named Father Gapon emerged as a leader. On a cold January morning, he led a massive procession of workers and their families through the snow-covered streets, all heading toward the Winter Palace. They marched in the hope that the Tsar would listen to their desperate pleas for justice and reform. The marchers carried religious icons and heartfelt petitions, symbols of their faith and their trust in the Tsar as their little father. They asked for better working conditions, fair wages, and an end to the devastating war. Their demands were simple, but their hopes were immense. But the Tsar, Nicholas II, was not in the palace to meet them. He had retreated to his country estate, far from the city's turmoil, leaving his officials to deal with the growing crisis. The Winter Palace stood empty and silent, a symbol of the ruler's distance from his people. As the peaceful crowd approached, soldiers suddenly opened fire without warning. Panic erupted as bullets tore through the unarmed men, women, and children. The snow was stained with blood, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the city. The massacre, which would become known as Bloody Sunday, sent shockwaves throughout the nation. Newspapers reported the horror, and stunned citizens struggled to comprehend the brutality unleashed upon them. In a single day, the Tsar's carefully crafted image as a benevolent and caring ruler was shattered. Many who had once revered him now saw only a distant monarch, indifferent to their suffering. Outrage swept across Russia like wildfire. Strikes, protests, and demonstrations erupted in cities and towns as people demanded change and justice. The events of Bloody Sunday ignited a firestorm of protest that would shake the very foundations of the Russian Empire. News of Bloody Sunday spread rapidly, sparking the 1905 revolution. Strikes erupted nationwide, crippling factories and transport. Students and intellectuals joined the protests, while peasants seized land in the countryside. The regime responded with brutal force, but repression only fueled more resistance. The Tsar's reliance on violence eroded his support, even among loyalists. For the first time, Russians from all walks of life united against autocracy. The revolution awakened a giant, exposing the regime's deep vulnerabilities. 1905 became a turning point, with consequences that would echo for years. Facing revolution, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, promising reforms to save his rule. The manifesto granted limited freedoms and created the Duma, a legislative assembly. Hopes for constitutional monarchy briefly flickered, yet the Tsar retained the power to veto laws and dissolve the Duma at will. The electoral system favored the elite, sidelining workers and peasants. The manifesto divided the opposition but failed to address the root causes of unrest. The concessions were too little, too late. The revolution entered a new, uncertain phase. The 1905 revolution forced the Tsar to grant limited freedoms, but real change was elusive. The Duma's power was restricted, and the Tsar undermined its authority at every turn. The fundamental structure of autocracy remained intact. Economic inequality, social injustice, and political oppression persisted. The revolution's achievements were incomplete, its promises unfulfilled. Discontent continued to fester beneath the surface. 1905 was a dress rehearsal for the greater upheaval to come. The warning signs for the Romanov dynasty were clear. The 1905 revolution cast a long shadow over Russian history, signaling the beginning of a turbulent era that would reshape the nation's destiny. In the bustling streets of St. Petersburg, hope and fear mingled as ordinary Russians dared to challenge the centuries-old autocracy. The events of that year would echo for generations, leaving scars and lessons that would not be easily forgotten. Bloody Sunday became a symbol of Tsarist brutality and the dangers of unchecked power. The massacre of peaceful demonstrators shocked the world and shattered the illusion that the Tsar was a benevolent ruler. The cries of the wounded and the grief of the families reverberated through Russian society, fueling anger and a thirst for change. The myth of the Tsar's invincibility was shattered. For the first time, many Russians saw their ruler as vulnerable, fallible, and even fearful. The once unquestioned authority of the monarchy began to crumble, replaced by uncertainty and suspicion. The revolution exposed deep divisions and planted seeds of doubt across the empire. Workers, peasants, and intellectuals found themselves united in protest, yet divided by their visions for Russia's future. The unrest revealed the fragility of the old order and the growing desire for reform, justice, and representation. Lessons learned in 1905 shaped the revolutionaries and the regime alike. Both sides studied the failures and successes of that year, preparing for the battles that lay ahead. The revolutionaries grew more organized and determined, while the Tsarist regime became increasingly repressive, desperate to maintain control. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they built on the legacy of 1905. The lessons of protest, resistance, and sacrifice became the foundation for a new revolution, one that would sweep away the old world and attempt to build a new society from its ashes. The fight for freedom and justice would continue, marked by setbacks and sacrifice. Each protest, each loss, and each small victory added to the growing momentum for change, inspiring future generations to keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. The spirit of 1905 endured, a harbinger of the storm to come. Its memory lived on in the hearts of those who dreamed of a better Russia, reminding them that even in the darkest times, the hope for transformation could never be fully extinguished.